All right, everybody. So real quick before this episode of the podcast starts, I wanted to give a little apology. So it may sound as if I'm a bit stuffy and or you might hear some slightly gross sniffling sounds and draining mucus sounds, but that's just because my sinuses are draining, I believe. I believe my sinuses are draining, and unfortunately it happened to happen right as I'm recording a podcast episode. So, yes, you might hear some slightly weird body sounds, but that's just my sinuses draining. And or mucus in my throat or some shit. I don't know how the body works. I'm not a fucking doctor. So, yes, give a preemptive spoiler warning for the S-Town podcast. For those of you who haven't heard it, I do spoil most of the plot, so be warned. There are spoilers, but I'm only doing spoilers because I can do them because this is my podcast. So yes, with that being said, let's get on to the episode. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Anything Everything podcast, episode 25. I'm your host, Adam, and oh, yep, there goes all my energy. Ow! Okay, no, not really. That was a weird bit. I don't know what was going on there. But seriously, welcome back to episode 25 of the Anything and Everything podcast. I know. I said I was going to have a fully filmed, proper podcast episode for this week. But in the process of editing the episode that was going to be episode 25, I got busy because, at least for me, it's finals week. Yes, you heard me right. Finals week. So yes, I'm busy with my college/university final exams or whatever you wish to call them. I'm not going to have a lot of time to edit together the original episode 25, which I had filmed. I did a video portion to what was going to be the original episode 25, but as you all know, the video portions tend to take a lot longer to edit because there's more processes involved. And yes, I'm busy with finals, so I won't get a chance to edit together the original episode 25. So I just decided to say, screw it, fuck it, I'll just make this week's episode 25. So this will be episode 25 of the podcast. And contrary to the beginning section there, this will actually be what is perhaps the most possibly chilled out episode I've ever done, which basically means I'm going to try not to go on too much of a rant. I'm actually just going to stay as calm as I possibly can. Oh, that's good. The first topic I wanted to talk about, in what was going to be last week's episode 25, I did a segment on the S-Town podcast, which for those of you who for some reason or another have not listened to the S-Town podcast, then first of all, what in the hell's wrong with you? What are you doing? Are you stupid? Have you been living under a rock for the last 8 or 9 months? 10 months? 9 months? I don't know. I have no sense of time anymore.
Wait, what's going on? Whoa!
But, no. But the S-Town podcast was a podcast done by This American Life, which is actually a radio program, as I looked up later, because when I first heard the S-Town podcast, which is produced by This American Life, I didn't actually know who they were because I hadn't looked them up, but they are a weekly hour-long radio program. I've not heard anything else they've done. I've not listened to anything else they've done so far, because as lame as it makes me sound and as lazy as it makes me sound, I just got done listening to the S-Town podcast. I know. I'm like 9 months late. 9 months.
You are a fucking child!
I can't get demonetized. Yeah. So it came out in March of this year, but I haven't listened to it until now. 9 months later. which I know that might actually be lazy. I don't know. But I have actually listened to the whole thing. And as I recommend this podcast, which I do, because the S-Town podcast, that's hard to say. It's a very good podcast. It's very well done. It's very well produced, very high quality, which of course it would be because This American Life is an actual legit radio program. So of course they'd have high quality shit. And I'll get into the whole synopsis and things about that shortly. But that's coming from me who likes sort of investigative kind of stuff. I like that kind of investigative journalism kind of programs. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the basic synopsis because I'm going to assume anyone listening to this podcast has already at least heard of the S-Town podcast, because the S-Town podcast got quite popular, I think. I believe I read somewhere that it had been down as of October. It had been downloaded 10 million times. That's a lot. 10 million times, which is far more than the actual population of Alabama. So that means people from outside of Alabama have heard of this podcast. So that leads me to my, I'll say, spoiler disclaimer. I am going to be spoiling the podcast. I am going to be talking about the S-Town podcast. I'm going to be basically spoiling the entire synopsis because I can. So get off my ass. And because I'm going to assume you've all at least heard of the S-Town podcast and or actually listened to the podcast itself. So if you haven't, I'm going to stop here and then you can all go listen to the S-Town podcast, then come back to this portion of my podcast, and then we can go from there. But I should mention the S-Town podcast is quite long because it's broken down into 7 episodes. So it is quite long. It's about, I'd say it's about 6 hours, I think. If you listen to all the episodes consecutively, it's like 6 hours. So it is very long. But if you have 6 hours to kill, like me, don't ask. It's none of your business. But that's not the point. If you have 6 hours to kill, go listen to the podcast. It's quite good, especially if you're into investigative stuff. It will be quite good, and you might like it. After you've listened to the S-Town podcast, come back to this time point, and we will continue. Okay, so you're back. You either all did listen to the S-Town podcast like I told you to, or you just didn't care and want to hear me talk about a podcast and spoil a podcast to its entirety. But okay. So the S-Town podcast, produced by This American Life, done by a guy named Brian Reed. So a man by the name of John B. McLemore called into This American Life and claimed he had heard that there had been a murder in the town of Woodstock, Alabama. Yes, there is a Woodstock, Alabama, of no relation to the Woodstock, New York, which is where they held that concert. And this Woodstock, Alabama, is in Bibb County, Alabama, which, relative to my location, I live in Shelby County, but I won't tell you exactly where because I don't want somebody to fucking stalk me, because that happens. But I do live in Shelby County. Here is Bibb County, and here is Shelby County. That's the relative location. Which I should mention, Woodstock is a town of roughly 1,500 people. The town has roughly 1,500 people. So that is not a lot. It is also not a very big town. As you can imagine, that is not a big place. It's literally one of those towns that most of the people actually know each other. Now, I have never been to Woodstock. I don't think I've ever been through Bibb County, nor have I ever been to Bibb County, nor do I ever care to go to Bibb County, because there's really nothing there, to be completely honest. There's nothing there that is of any importance to me, because Bibb County itself is not very large. As I'll show here, they have Bibb County itself, the county as a whole, roughly has 22,000 people in the county, in the entire county. For reference, here in Shelby County, we have about roughly 210,643. So, yes, Shelby County is quite the more populated, quite the more urbanized and such. Okay, so now we're going to go into the synopsis of the S-Town podcast, and good God, this is going to be a lot. So, bear with me here. This is probably the most in-depth, just a lot of info podcast I've ever heard in my entire life. So there's going to be a lot of info with this whole thing. So, preparing my vocal cords for the long thing I'm going to be talking about here. The reason why this podcast is called the S-Town Podcast is due to the subject of this podcast, who was a John B. McLemore, who was a horologist, or that is somebody who studies time and time-related things. So John B. McLemore lived in, as he called it, Shittown, Alabama, which is hilarious to me. But that's what he referred to, Woodstock, Alabama. He was basically the town weirdo. He was basically the weirdo of Woodstock, Alabama, which is a big honor, I guess. I don't know. He would collect things, collect clocks, sundials, horologist stuff like that. I don't know, because I'd never actually heard of horology prior to this podcast, so I didn't know what it was. But they mostly poked fun at him because McLemore would constantly talk about political stuff, global warming, conspiracy theories, shit that was wrong with the world, shit that was wrong with Bibb County and Woodstock, which, from listening to this podcast, sounds like quite a lot, but I could be wrong. And basically, he would just keep talking about stuff that nobody else really cared to listen to about, and he would just annoy a lot of the other townsfolk with how much he would talk about stuff that they didn't really care about. So yes, he was basically the town weirdo. So the whole synopsis is that he called into the staff at This American Life, the radio show, and asked them to investigate a murder he had heard happened in Woodstock, Alabama, involving a bunch of kids at a party. A guy by the name of Kabram Burt. Yes, Kabram Burt. This is how it's actually spelled. I'm not sure where that name comes from, but Kabram Burt was a kid at the party. They were all at a party in Woodstock, in the woods of Woodstock. That's an interesting alloquy of words. And according to what John McLemore says, he heard from the other townspeople that a murder had happened after one of Kabram Burt's friends had his neck cut by a kid by the name of Dylan Nichols. And then Kabram Burt proceeds to tackle the Dylan Nichols kid and beat him to death, as what John heard. And he wanted the staff at This American Life to investigate the murder because he did not trust the Bibb County Sheriff's Office to investigate it properly, because he claims they were all very, very corrupt and things of that nature. A person with This American Life, Brian Reed, who is a journalist and the host of this particular podcast, he actually does decide to go down to Woodstock, Alabama and investigate. Brian Reed, the journalist, lives in New York, so that's a long way to go to investigate a crime, going all the way from New York City to Woodstock, Alabama, because that's not a mean-spirited joke, because one, I'm from Alabama, so I could do it. Two, the people he interviews in the podcast from Woodstock and Bibb County claims that that's what Bibb County is like. They claim that Bibb County and Woodstock are the most redneck places you could possibly be. So, as I said, the journalist Brian Reed goes down to investigate a murder that he has only been told has happened by some random older man in what he calls Shittown, Alabama, because John McLemore called it Shittown, Alabama, because that's how much he hated Woodstock. He hated Woodstock so much that he called it Shittown, Alabama. So he hated Woodstock. He said it was redneck, backwards. They were all, Bible thumpers and all that kind of stuff. But what most people would expect when they hear Alabama, which I don't blame you if that's what you actually think, you're not completely wrong. Here come the spoilers. So the murder that John McLemore claims to have heard that it actually happened is wrong. There was no actual murder. There was a bunch of kids did hold a party in Woodstock, Alabama, but nobody murdered anyone. There was no murder. And Cabram Burt and some of his buddies did turn around, tackle the kid, and beat him up. They did not kill the kid, though. The kid that Cabram Burt and his buddies beat up didn't die. He survived. Everyone survived. The kid went to the hospital. A couple of people went to the hospital and things like that. Actually happened in the Tuscaloosa County, Alabama portion of Woodstock, because Woodstock lies in two separate counties here in Alabama. Bibb County, which is where it's mostly located. A portion of the town is in Tuscaloosa County. You might know that name from being where the University of Alabama is. The Crimson Tide football team, the one that apparently wins everything and people don't like it, but I don't really care because I don't like football, but we're not talking about that. So this happened in the Tuscaloosa County portion of Woodstock, where, contrary to what John McLemore says, the Tuscaloosa County Sheriff's Office did investigate the fight and all of that, investigated it properly and did everything right, ended up closing the case and the investigation because none of the people at the party wanted to press charges, so they just dropped the case. Bibb County had nothing to do with it. After I heard that portion, I actually thought, okay, so did the John McLemore lie to Brian Reed about the whole murder? In my personal opinion, I think that the whole murder aspect happened because like I said, this was a actual party. So basically what I would assume to be a bunch of kids in the woods of Woodstock, Alabama, in Tuscaloosa County, doing drugs and drinking and all that, which Cabram Burt admits to. He admits that they were doing drugs and drinking and all that. And of course, you got to think, a bunch of kids on drugs, they see a fight break out, they're going to shit and scatter, and they're just going to assume, oh shit, we saw these people punching each other, so somebody had to have died. Nobody could survive being beaten like that. And they just let their imaginations get the better of them. So I think that's what led to this whole murder speculation, in my opinion anyway. So that's what makes it interesting. You basically get to learn a lot about the John B. McLemore fellow and the other people and Woodstock itself and Bibb County itself. And it's just very interesting. You get to learn about these people, all of that kind of stuff, and learn pretty much the entire history of Woodstock, which is not very long because Woodstock was incorporated in 1999. That's when it became an incorporated town. And it was originally called North Bibb. North Bibb was the original name of the town of Woodstock when it was incorporated, but apparently the people there thought it was boring. They thought the name North Bibb was too boring, so they wanted to change it to something more exciting. And they chose Woodstock for some reason. I guess maybe based off of the Woodstock, New York. I'm not sure. So I had heard of Woodstock, Alabama before this podcast. Just a very interesting podcast. At the risk of this going on far too long, John McLemore, who unfortunately committed suicide while the podcast was still in production, committed suicide sometime in 2015 by drinking cyanide, which I don't think they ever explain how John McLemore got a hold of cyanide. I didn't know they even still made cyanide. Why they would still make cyanide, I don't know. And most of the episodes after episode 2 go on to talk about John's suicide and all of that kind of unfortunate stuff. And they do talk about how John McLemore was very depressed or claimed to have been depressed and all of this. How John McLemore he never did find a steady romantic partner, which I can already agree with because that's me right now. That was fake crying, by the way, if you couldn't tell. Yes, it's just a very good podcast. I recommend it, even if you're not from Alabama. All right, everybody. So for this segment of the episode, I actually waited a full day to record this because I basically had to wait a full day to record this because I'm actually going to be talking about, as I'm sure even people who don't live in Alabama have probably heard, at least by now, of course, you will have all have heard of Roy Moore. And yes, I know I continually referred to him in many of the episodes that I've done so far, but this will pretty much be officially the last time I talk about Roy Moore, unless he actually does something really fucking crazy. Then I will inform you all, but other than that, so even those of you from outside of Alabama, even you all may know that we had a Senate election in Alabama, and most of you only know that because of Roy Moore, because of what Roy Moore was accused of supposedly doing, which I won't get into because I've talked about that already. But yes, most of you have probably heard of all of that whole debacle, or some other strange term you might use to describe it. But as a citizen of Alabama, I did actually vote yesterday, and of course, obviously, I voted for Doug Jones. But if there's any good thing come from this, it's that Roy Moore did not win. Yeah! Woo! It's party time, motherfuckers. Yeah! Fuck you, Roy Moore. Fuck you, you old wrinkly, homophobic, child-touching, Bible-thumping, Jesus-obsessed fucking nutcase. Have fun in the loser's corners, you fuck. You old wrinkly bastard. Okay, I'm done with that now. I got it out of my system. Let this be a lesson to all of the, and notice what I'm saying here, let this be a lesson to all of the crazy religious people. Notice what I said there. Crazy religious people. And when I say crazy religious people, I mean, let this be a lesson to those people who try to force their religion on other people. Let this be a lesson to the people who force Christianity on each other or other people. You can't force your religious beliefs on people because it won't work. It never has worked, ever. Ever. As far as I know, at least not in the last 50 or so years, and it'll just get you hated by a majority of your state, or at least a majority of your state's young people. I decided to save this for the last segment because I felt like it was a good segment to end on. So this will be going at the end of the podcast. So therefore, if you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, you guys on SoundCloud can like the track, comment on the track, all other sorts of things, I think. I don't actually know. I'm not sure what all you can do with tracks on SoundCloud now. And all you guys on YouTube can thumbs up the video, thumbs down the video, comment on the video, whatever you wish to. And I will see you guys in next week's episode. I'm out this bitch.